Welcome back to From Israel with Love. This is Ben Kerido coming to you from Jerusalem. And while things have quieted down in the past few days, we've had a pretty crazy week here in the Holy Land. On the afternoon of August 5th, 2022, Israeli fighter jets screamed towards the Gaza Strip. An airstrike operation that lasted less than 3 minutes successfully eliminated a man by the name of Taser Jabari, a top commander of the terrorist organization known as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as several squads of Gazan militants en route to attack Jewish targets along the border. Leading up to the airstrike, Israeli forces had already arrested Bassam al-Sadi. This man was the leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Yehuda Shomron region, which is also referred to as the West Bank. The conflict escalated as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad commenced the firing of over 1,000 rockets and mortars into Israeli territory. While most were intercepted by the world-famous Iron Dome defense system, there was some wounding of civilians and soldiers, as well as damage to Jewish infrastructure. Really interesting to note, hundreds of terrorist rockets landed within the Gaza Strip, never even entering Israeli territory. Instead, the PIJ killed and maimed their own Palestinian Arab civilians with the poorly aimed and/or malfunctioning rockets. The Hamas-led Gazan Ministry of Health claimed that Israel was responsible, but Israeli officials immediately released video evidence of the reality that Gazan terrorists themselves had bombed their own population, presumably by mistake, and then falsely blamed Israeli forces. While all this was going on, I remember I was watching outside of my apartment window as more Israeli jet aircraft soared overhead. A few miles to the west of my apartment, where I live with my wife, air raid sirens were blaring in a mournful wail, warning of incoming rockets that might not be destroyed mid-flight by the Iron Dome. Now, me, being a Special Forces reservist in the Israel Defense Force, I noted that Defense Minister Benny Gantz had authorized the possible deployment of 25,000 reservists, which would include myself if the directive was given. So I established communication with my commanding officer to wait my orders. In the end, I did not go in, and my wife was very, very happy and grateful for that. Truthfully, I kind of wanted to go in, but, that's the way that goes. 66 hours after the conflict dubbed by Israel as Operation Breaking Dawn had begun, it ended very abruptly. A ceasefire had been enacted in record time. It ostensibly went into effect at 11:30 p.m. on August 7th, with Palestinian Islamic Jihad firing barrages of rockets just after that time to get the last word in. And that's something that they always do every time we do a ceasefire for about 10, 15, 30 minutes, whatever it is after the ceasefire. It's so childish. They have to launch some rockets or do like one last attack to show that they're not truly bound by the ceasefire. Then they run and scurry and say, okay, yeah, now there's a ceasefire. It's a very dirty, childish thing, and they do this every single time. While those in America and other Western countries might not understand the ramifications of this 3-day mini-war, there is seemingly much more at play behind the scenes that is contextual common knowledge to Israelis. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad has an arrangement with Hamas that is often misunderstood by the West. The PIJ is essentially a subcontracted terrorist organization operating at the behest of Hamas, doing Hamas's dirty work similar to a hitman, if you will. The purpose of this cooperation is to enable Hamas, the official leadership of Gaza, to conduct terror attacks against Israel while supposedly maintaining deniability of any involvement to the international community. Then, when Israel strikes back in self-defense, Hamas screams and wails and whines that they are the victims of unprovoked violence, supposedly. After all, Hamas claims, it wasn't them, it was their supposedly rogue subordinate allies, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that attacked Israel, as in with weapons and funding provided in part by both Hamas and Iran. So how dare the IDF return fire and hold Hamas equally responsible? The supposed logic here is akin to a husband hiring his best friend as a hitman to murder his wife, and then that husband complains when he is also arrested for murder along with the hitman. As completely ridiculous as this fallacy is, this is the rhetoric that echoes throughout the United Nations, throughout liberal college campuses, throughout social media forums, and beyond in condemnation of the one and only Jewish state seeking to defend itself from wave upon wave of terrorist violence. Quite notably, the General Secretary and top leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Ziad Nakaleh, was actually in Tehran when Operation Breaking Dawn began. He was meeting with General Hossein Salami, the head of the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and a key comrade in arms to the now deceased General Qasem Soleimani. You might remember that Soleimani was the international terrorist assassinated in January of 2020 at the order of then-President Donald J. Trump, despite unfathomable protests from key leaders in the Democratic Party. Just a month ago, Joe Biden visited the Jewish state, meeting with Israeli leadership in Jerusalem. Interim Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid announced during their meeting in a public press conference, he said, "Words and diplomacy will not stop Iran, Mr. President. The only way to stop Iran is to put a credible military threat on the table." Biden, however, publicly disagreed with Lapid and refuted the Israeli premier. "I continue to believe," Biden said, "that diplomacy is the best way to achieve this outcome." Here in Israel, we are all painfully aware about how woefully ineffective the Biden administration's supposed diplomacy has been, including against President Vladimir Putin and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And former President Obama's methodology of shipping pallets of cash to Iran, and yes, he did do that despite mainstream media's claims to the contrary, shipping pallets of cash to Iran did little more than bolster Iran's nuclear ambitions and fund international terrorism. The concept of firm and credible deterrence seems to be completely lost on the leading members of the Democratic Party. And even left-wing Israeli political leaders are pleading on Biden's deaf ears to immediately change course, but seemingly to no avail. When we string all this together and all these contextual items and look at them as a whole picture, we begin to see a scenario in which Iran, undaunted and even emboldened by Biden's diplomacy of appeasement and visible weakness, is openly working with Hamas and their quote-unquote hitman, the Gazan terrorist organization called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ. In other words, the implication is that Iran might be seeking to incite a Middle Eastern war using Hamas's standard tactics of nonsense rhetoric, falsely portraying Israel as the villain and thus justifying Iranian aggression. In response, the Israel Defense Force preemptively scrambled to arrest or assassinate key terrorist leadership and mitigate terror operations already in process, and thereby thwart the plans of Palestinian Arab terrorists and even of Iran itself, whatever those plans may be. Now, one thing that's really interesting to note about all this, and something I have a little bit of a personal experience with, normally ceasefire agreements between Israel and Gazan terrorists take at least days and usually more like weeks to be agreed upon, with a country like Egypt or someone like that, Egypt, maybe Qatar, being a broker. In this case, however, it was a matter of hours before the Israel Defense Force had agreed to back down even while mid-assault. In over 15 years of service in the Israel Defense Force, I have only seen this phenomenon occur once before. While actively fighting in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead at the beginning of 2009, I and the rest of my fellow combatants were ordered by Israeli political leadership to halt and depart without delay. We were informed that then U.S. President-elect Barack Obama had demanded that we stop our highly successful counter-terror operation immediately as he prepared for his inauguration and the commencement of the Obama-Biden administration that was coming up in just days at that point. The left-wing Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, immediately buckled, apparently, with little to no resistance. Within a few hours, thousands of IDF personnel abandoned our in-process combat missions, and we trekked silently out of the Gaza Strip along a dark, starlit beach in an unending double column of Israeli soldiers. Now, here we are in 2022, Israel had been fighting a terrorist organization that was in direct in-person communication with the leader of the Iranian Islamic Republican Guard Corps a mere 3 weeks after President Biden insisted that diplomacy, and we all know what Biden's diplomacy looks like, he insisted that diplomacy, not military action, was the only acceptable means of repelling Tehran. In a matter of hours, the left-wing Israeli Prime Minister canceled all military action in a manner oddly reminiscent of the Obama-demanded Israeli unilateral withdrawal of 2009. Is this a mere coincidence? Let me put it this way. To my knowledge, there are no publicly released statements or records on the matter, but we can all form our own opinions on this situation. And I'll leave it at that. Interestingly enough, my wife and I have recently written and published a novel called The American Holocaust early tomorrow morning. There was also a special edition of the novel released as Let's Go Brandon the Novel, and you might have heard of that. At any rate, the novel describes in detail the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and their relationship to Hamas and a nuclear ambitious Iran. The plot addresses that these terrorist organizations receive funding and direction from Iran and explains how they operate in the Gaza Strip, including the ostensibly accidental bombing of their own civilians followed by false accusations against Israel. So, has our thriller novel turned out to be pseudo-prophetic? Well, not hardly, unfortunately. This situation is a tired old tune that we in Israel, and especially those of us who serve in the Israeli military, are all too familiar with. Here in Israel, we have an expression that counter-terror military operations in the Gaza Strip are nothing more than, as we say, mowing the lawn. In other words, it's only a matter of time before the Palestinian Arab terrorists will gear up for another round of fighting. And with the Biden administration failing to deter anyone besides young girls who dislike being sniffed by a dementia-ridden elderly man, for Israelis the proverbial writing is on the wall regarding an immense and inevitable conflict in the Middle East, very possibly involving nuclear weapons. At this point, I hate to say it, but all we can do is hope and pray that the plot of our thriller novel remains the stuff of fiction and imagination. Because so far, we're not off to a great start. This has been Kerido coming to you from Jerusalem, over and out, and see you next time. Hey everyone, this is Ben Kerido here to tell you about my brand new book that I wrote with my wife, Surat, called Let's Go Brandon the Novel. It's a satirical parody in the style of Orwell's 1984, The Babylon Bee, and Fauda. It's both a suspenseful and hilarious portrayal of current affairs in the American, Israeli, and Middle Eastern political arenas and military spheres, and includes some delightfully vicious yet comical mockery of Biden, AOC, and many others. For a limited time, the book is being made available for free or heavily discounted to our readers. Check it out on Amazon or visit our website, itowerpublishing.com. Links in the video description.